Nevertheless, even among the rulers many believed in him. But because of the Pharisees they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God.
Today we are going to explore what I would call the parable of the unclean spirit, found in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 12. In our text, Jesus portrays an unclean spirit's reaction to being cast out of a man. I suspect that most people wouldn't recognize this account as a parable, treating the account as a straightforward description of demonic activity. The majority assumption seems to favor a literal interpretation of the account. Jesus' portrayal of the unclean spirit reads like a non-fictional description of what happened to an actual unclean spirit and what happened to the man it inhabited. Other than the fact that the account features a non-corporeal entity, it doesn't read like mythology or allegory. Let's have a look at the text.
Now when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest, and does not find it. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the last state of that man becomes worse than the first. That is the way it will also be with this evil generation.
Typically, Jesus makes use of everyday situations in order to draw an analogy between our common experience and an important point he wants to make. The account of an unclean spirit reads like nonfiction, but it doesn't describe everyday situations, like a farmer sowing a field or a woman making dough. The parable of the unclean spirit is not recognizable as a parable because the account describes an activity found outside of everyone's normal experience. Many of us have seen a farmer at work, but not many of us have seen an unclean spirit, let alone what an unclean spirit does on vacation. So why do I think this account is parabolic? For me, it's a question of relevance. Why did Jesus tell this story? What does this information contribute to our understanding of his main idea? Why did Matthew place the story later in the chapter? I hope to answer these questions a bit later, but before I do, I would like to survey the larger context. To help us understand what we are about to read, I should introduce an economic concept known as a black swan. Quoting Investopedia, the term was popularized by Nassim Nichols Taleb, a finance professor, writer, and former Wall Street trader. Taleb wrote about the idea of a black swan event in 2007 book prior to the events of 2008 financial crisis. Taleb describes a black swan as an event that, 1, is so rare that even the possibility that it might occur is unknown. 2, it has a catastrophic impact when it does occur. And 3, it's explained in hindsight as if it were actually predictable. End of quote. For this video, I would like to define black swan as a catastrophic event that disrupts the established order. In this case, the religious system run by the chief priests and the Pharisees. A black swan in this context is any event that might destroy the system they manage or remove the chief priests and Pharisees from leadership in Israel. From the perspective of these men, any miracle of Jesus which is sufficient to establish him as the Messiah is a possible prelude to a black swan. Even Jesus understood that his miracles and provocative words might be the catalyst for a black swan, which is why he often withdrew to the mountain by himself alone, whenever he perceived that the crowd intended to take him by force, to make him king. If the crowds removed the current leaders and set Jesus on the throne of David by force, the Romans would have no choice but to put down the rebellion, take away Jewish law, forbid Jewish religious practices, and re-establish Roman dominion over the region. In fact, this very thing took place during the Jewish-Roman Wars of 70 AD and the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 AD. These two events demonstrated that fears of a black swan event were justified. John gives us an inside look at the deliberations of the chief priests and Pharisees as they discuss what they understand as a potential black swan.
Therefore the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, "What are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish." Now he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him.
As Professor Talib said, it is important for people to always assume a black swan event is a possibility, whatever it may be, and to try to plan accordingly. The chief priests and Pharisees were certainly aware of the prophetic word concerning a coming king of David, but looking through the eyes of these men, the miracles of Jesus look like preludes to a black swan. In the context of Jesus' teaching that he is the Messiah, the King of Israel, his miracles seem to portend a change in the established order. In light of this, it behooves the Pharisees to discredit Jesus whenever possible. For this purpose, the Pharisees apparently decided to discredit Jesus by telling the crowds that Jesus' ability to cast out demons is sufficient evidence to suggest that Jesus is a servant of Satan.
Then a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute was brought to Jesus, and he healed him so that the mute man spoke and saw. All the crowds were amazed and were saying, "This man cannot be the son of David, can he?" But when the Pharisees heard this, they said, "This man casts out demons only by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons." And knowing their thoughts, Jesus said to them, "Any kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and any city or house divided against itself will not stand. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? If I by Beelzebul cast out demons, by whom do your sons cast them out? For this reason they will be your judges. But if I cast out demons by the Spirit of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. Or how can anyone enter the strong man's house and carry off his property, unless he first binds the strong man, and then he will plunder his house?"
The healing of the demon-possessed man was as compelling as an earthquake. A miracle of this type begs the question, what just happened? And what does it mean? Sometimes when an earthquake shakes the ground, it not only disturbs our composure, it raises doubt about other things which we always held as immutable. That is, if the ground can move out of its place, then what other things which we once held to be unalterable and ageless might suddenly fail? The miracles of Jesus certainly had an impact on the Jewish society at the time, raising the specter of a coming change of direction for Jewish culture. Perhaps the established order is about to fall, being replaced by another order of which Jesus is the head. Are the miracles of Jesus like dispatches from a turbulent times ahead? Based on what the crowd witnessed, they seemed to conclude that the miracle was sufficient to establish Jesus as the Messiah, the coming Son of David. From the perspective of the Pharisees, however, the miracle is like a lit fuse, leading to catastrophic results. For this reason, the Pharisees are compelled to explain what happened as if it were actually predictable. These men present the crowds with an alternative, false narrative, one that they hope will persuade them to doubt the implications of what they just saw. They claim that Jesus cast out demons by the power of Satan, which isn't true and can be easily challenged and defeated. I mean, it isn't as if the Pharisees weren't also convinced that the miracle was sufficient to establish him as the Messiah, but this realization would certainly cause fear in the hearts of the Pharisees, who were afraid that the Romans might come and remove them from their place. In order to nip this thing in the bud, the Pharisees resort to a bit of propaganda, hoping to gaslight the crowds, causing them to question what they just saw. But the truth always dispels propaganda, which is why the Lord gave the crowds the 3 arguments contradicting the false narrative. By these 3 arguments, Jesus defeats and contradicts the Pharisaical propaganda, leaving the crowd with a decision whether or not to accept the arguments of Jesus and thereafter accept the evidence set before them by the Holy Spirit. Or will the crowds accept the argument of the Pharisees instead? Jesus seems to predict that his generation will not accept his arguments. The crowds will side with the Pharisees instead, eventually. He illustrates this idea with a story about an unclean spirit.
Now when the unclean spirit goes out of a man, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest, and does not find it. Then it says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds it unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it goes and takes along with it 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And the last state of that man becomes worse than the first. That is the way it will also be with this evil generation.
For the sake of this video, let's assume that the account of the unclean spirit is based on fact and not imagined. The question of relevance is why I believe this section is intended as a parable. This section reads like a story, and we understand that Jesus sometimes uses stories to illustrate spiritual lessons. By suggesting that this section is parabolic, I'm not at the same time suggesting that the account isn't literally true. Just as I'm certain that farmers literally sow fields, I'm pretty sure that demons possess people and wander the land searching for waterless places. So then, assuming this is a parable, what can we say about it? As with all of Jesus' parables, we know that the details of the story serve the story itself, but the central or critical point is found in the analogy. For instance, consider the parable of the sower. The farming analogy isn't meant to give us additional details about farming. Instead, the story taken as a whole is intended to illustrate something else. Namely, just as fruit is the result of harrowed ground, persistent faith is the result of an honest and good heart. Likewise, a story about a demon in search of waterless places is not intended to add to our knowledge of demonology, even though it might. The critical point of the parable is to be understood by comparison to the analog. I maintain that if, after we read the story, we stop and call it a day, we will miss an important idea that Jesus is attempting to illustrate here. This information concerning unclean spirits is relevant because it serves to highlight a fundamental principle of unbelief. But first, as with all the other parables, we need to explicate the story. My advice to anyone seeking to understand one of Jesus' parables is to first take stock of the story on its own terms. Then, after that, make the connection between the story and the analogy. While the story of the unclean spirit is a bit unfamiliar, the essential motives and actions of the unclean spirit are understandable. We don't know, for instance, how a spirit goes into a man or goes out of a man, but granting that as a given, the rest of the parable seems fairly straightforward. A spirit is forced to leave home. Once outside, it finds a hostile environment, and it's unable to find rest. It decides to return to the house from where it came. It finds the house unoccupied, swept, and put in order. Then it invites 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. Listing the essential aspects of the story, we have 1. A spirit is cast out of its house. 2. It seeks waterless places to rest. 3. It returns to the original house. 4. It invites 7 other spirits to live there. Now that we understand the basics of the story and account for all of its features, we are ready to find the target idea within the teaching of Jesus. In this instance, we need go no further than the context of Matthew chapter 12, specifically Jesus' arguments against the false narrative offered by the Pharisees. The parable seeks to highlight what can happen in the mind of a person once a fallacious claim has been refuted. In the hands of a religious authority like the Pharisees, a false narrative presented to the Jewish culture can become a meme, a pervasive thought that replicates itself via cultural means, especially if the established order enforces the meme through social sanction. After the Pharisees presented false information to the crowds, attempting to discredit Jesus Christ, the mental image they hatched became a cultural meme. In the parable, the unclean spirit is cast out of a man, presumably by someone stronger than the spirit. In the analogy, Jesus refutes a false narrative presented by the Pharisees. In order to refute the false narrative, Jesus presents a stronger alternative explanation, based in fact, which was strong enough to enter the minds of the crowd and render the idea indefensible. The parable mentions that the spirit was looking for waterless places. Apparently, unclean spirits don't like the water, and they find no comfort wherever water exists. The analogy highlights the reality that a false narrative, even though refuted, doesn't die. Like an unclean spirit that has been cast out, a false narrative survives as a cultural meme and remains as a viable alternative for those unprepared to reject it. In the parable, the unclean spirit returns to the house from which it came. It finds the house unoccupied, swept, and put in order. In the analogy, the unoccupied house represents the skeptical mind. After the false idea was refuted, unfortunately, the individual remains agnostic. Having rejected the absurd narrative offered by the Pharisees, the mind was freed to land on the solid proof that Jesus offered. But instead, the crowds remained agnostic. The agnostic mind, having not landed firmly on the truth, is like a waterless place to a cultural meme. As worries about persecution, intimidation, and cancel culture weigh heavily on the mind, fear grips the agnostic, pressuring the mind to believe the meme, though it was solidly refuted. In the parable, the unclean spirit invites 7 other spirits to live in the house. In the analogy, Jesus' generation accepted, out of fear, a false cultural meme as true. The 7 other spirits represent the fortification of the false narrative, whereby an individual begins to affirm other false narratives spread throughout the culture as memes. This fate will befall his generation, Jesus predicts. Many of his own people will believe what the Pharisees said about him and allow the original false narrative to stand. And beginning with that false narrative, his people would begin to accept all kinds of other false narratives. In the opinion of the Jewish culture at the time, challenging the established order is evil and must not be allowed to stand. And evil people deserve to die. Because of this, the crowd who originally adored Jesus will shout, "Crucify him, crucify him," in the end, having become convinced by Pharisaical propaganda to hate Jesus. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful to your own studies. If you did, please share this video with another person. Thanks for watching.